Welcome to the Face to Face. I'm your host, Genevieve Lefebvre. The Face to Face is a bilingual series of video recorded here at the Société francophone de Maillardville. We acknowledge that La Société francophone de Maillardville operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coquitlam. We thank them to continue to live on these lands and care for them along with the water and all what is above and below. Today, we have with us Nancy Fruness. Nancy is the co-founder of the Wondrous Tree Fellowship, and she also holds a PhD in ecophysiology. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you for coming. Nancy, I have been to one of your events with my little kids, and they loved it. They had a great time. So I have touched and feel a little bit what is your initiative, but I want to invite you to explain to us what is the Wondrous Tree Fellowship.
Sure. Wondrous Tree Fellowship is a community group, so we're very grassroots, and we're a fairly small core group of people that do the organizing. We're all passionate about trees and the environment. And then we have a larger sort of group of volunteers that come and help us out at the events, like the event that you went to. And then we have a much larger group of people that come and attend the events. So we don't actually have a membership formally, but we do have a lot of people that follow us. And the event that you're talking about was our Wild Species Day event. So we do three things. We educate, we advocate, and we celebrate when it comes to trees. And the event, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of those other events, but the event that you came to was one where we combined education, advocacy, and celebration. It was the Wild Species Day celebration. And we had initially wanted to have a protest because we don't have any species at risk legislation in BC right now. And we wanted to raise awareness about that. But the BC government, just before we were going to announce our event, they came out with a couple of announcements. One of them was the nature agreement, saying that they are going to put aside 30% of the land by 2030 to protect the ecosystem and species. And they also put forward a BC biodiversity framework. So we had to shift a little bit and go from a protest to a celebration, because that is really good news. We have a long, long ways to go still, but those were really good first steps to provide some protection for biodiversity. So the celebration part was we had the Vancouver Carnival Band come out. We had holiday swag making. We had free cider and popcorn. And then the education, we had educational displays. And then the advocacy part was where we had speakers come. We had Ed Hall, who's the former chief of Coquitlam First Nation, come out, and he always is very eloquently speaks about the environment and our connection to it. We had the Wilderness Committee, Joe Foy, come out and talk about the northern spotted owl. And we also had Sierra Club, Asher Goodman, come out. And as well, we had James Bobbitt from Wondrous Tree Fellowship talking about Wondrous Tree Fellowship. So we do a variety of different events, but that particular one that you attended was Wild Species Day.
It was very lovely, very lovely. So why have you guys created the fellowship, the Wondrous Tree Fellowship?
Yeah, so why we created it was we were noticing a lot of trees coming down in our own community, and it was causing us concern. And then we had one particular tree that came down. It was a beautiful dawn redwood in Port Coquitlam, and it just sort of provided the impetus for us to come together and start to do something. We felt that we needed to speak up. We were just simply seeing too many trees coming down. And in Port Coquitlam, we saw over 200 mostly healthy, mature trees come down just in the small downtown core area. So that we used to have this very leafy small town feel, and having all the trees come down really changed the atmosphere of the town. So we felt that we needed to speak up and needed to advocate for the trees.
So what's the impact of saving one tree at a time?
saving one tree at a time doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're in an urban environment, the closer the tree is to the center of the urban area or the downtown, the more valuable it becomes. And trees do so much for us I'll just speak specifically about an urban environment. So they do things like they'll take up carbon dioxide and they'll sequester carbon. We know that we need that for climate change to help mitigate the effects. The trees also produce oxygen, which we need as human beings to survive. The trees provide a lot of ecological services. Mm-hmm. So things like stormwater management, they help us to intercept rain and slow down the rain and allow it to sort of be absorbed into the soil. And so it stops surface runoff and localized flooding. They also are super important because you'll remember a couple of years ago we had that heat dome. And trees are just really efficient and wonderful at cooling down our hot urban environments. So if we stand under the shade of a tree, the temperature can be up to 8 degrees Celsius cooler than if we're standing out on an open pavement. And so trees block out the sun, the heat from the sun, by shading them. And then they also do something really cool called evapotranspiration. So they, for the roots will take up water out of the soil, one molecule at a time, and it'll be like a chain, and it'll pull the water right from the roots up the stem of the tree and out through little openings in the leaves called stomates. And it's like an unbroken chain. So when that molecule of water comes out of the leaf, it evaporates and it cools the air. So they're really working overtime all the time to make our environment better. We also know for mental health, they're really, really important for our mental health. Cities are noisy, they're busy, and when we're in an urban environment, we get something called sort of a fight or flight reaction. So we're ready, like we're fired up, and there's a lot of stress. But if you have trees, they have a calming effect, and they're one of the best stress reducers you can get. And also providing habitat, much needed habitat in urban areas for wildlife and birds and even bats.
Is there any specific kind of tree that are more in danger in an urban area?
Okay, well, I would think that some of the trees that are really endangered are ones that are not drought resistant. So when we plant trees in an urban area, we're putting them into a really harsh environment. We're asking them to grow in areas where the soil is compacted. So they're having trouble, getting water to come down into the soil. They're quite often surrounded by pavement. There's pollution. There's all sorts of, lack of space. They don't get maintained well. So some of the trees that we're seeing really struggle now include ones like western red cedar, which is an iconic West Coast species. Mm-hmm. And we are seeing them. You might notice that there's western red cedars, they're turning red. And that's from drought quite often. They're not getting the water they need. Hemlocks are another native species that are really struggling now. So there are some species that, just aren't doing well under a drier summers, like we're getting droughtier summers. And then in the winter, we're getting lots of rain, but in very intense episodes. So not sort of, distributed evenly across time. But the good news is that there are some trees that are very well adapted to those environments. So we might see some trees that aren't native species that do well in an urban environment. And some examples are things like London plane trees, ginkgo trees. They're not native. They may not support the same sort of biodiversity that we have now, but they do fill other niches and help us out in a very highly urbanized, polluted sort of situation.
Is it information like this that you guys are teaching with your programs? Can you touch on that?
Sure. For the education, we've done all kinds of things. So we do talk about that. We had a museum exhibit several years ago, and it was called The Secret Life of Trees. So it ran for 7 months, I believe, in the Port Coquitlam Museum, and it talked all about those kind of things. It talked about how trees communicate, how trees produce oxygen, and all of the things that trees do, human health and habitat and that sort of thing. So we do educate that way. We also take guided tree walks. And as we're walking, we talk about the trees and what they do. We do workshops on things like this summer. We had one on cottonwood and how all the wonderful things that cottonwood trees do for us, including some medicinal effects. So we made an ointment called Balm of Gilead, which is very good for inflammation. So we had somebody come in and help us do that. We've taken school groups out. We took one group up to Burke Mountain and spent the day there talking about ecology. And just earlier this year, James and I took out about 100 grade 11 home ec students, and we did a foraging workshop out in Bert Flynn Park. So we talked about all the edible plants and how how the forest is basically a big grocery store if we know how to use it. Mm-hmm. And we've also done pollinator walks for kindergarten students and just all sorts of things like that. So yeah, lots of education is sort of built into the programs that we provide.
Interesting. So what's happening these days with the Riverview tree walks?
Riverview. So Riverview has been renamed as Semekoala. And it's I used to be on the board of the Riverview Horticultural Society. I'm no longer on the board, so I can't speak for them, but I can talk a little bit about the situation there. So Riverview lands are home to the oldest open-grown arboretum in Western Canada. It's an outstanding collection of diverse species of trees gathered from all around the temperate world, and it's open to the public. So Riverview Hort Society had, for many years, for the past 30 years, have taken guided tree walks through those lands. And they're free, open to the public, and they're led by an arborist. So people get to learn about the trees and get to connect with the trees and really get to stand under some of the canopies of those huge giants. And what's happened now is BC Housing has oversight of those lands, and they've started to impose fees. And right now there's about, I think it's $825 for permitting and also to cover the costs of having a liaison monitor the walks. And then now they've also put in another requirement to have a portable washroom on site for each walk. So each walk now is costing about $1,000. So it's a little bit disappointing because I think that the intent is maybe to stop people from going on those tree walks, stop people from connecting with the trees and, loving the trees and learning about the trees, because when those lands are developed, then if people aren't connected with the trees, they won't know what they're missing or what they're losing. So there's a lot of complexity around the site. There's also a First Nations land claim that's active from Coquitlam First Nation. So anything that is done on those lands needs to be done with the spirit of reconciliation. So it's a very complex situation there.
I can see how those prices are not easy when you're talking about nonprofit, and every nonprofit, they're trying to spend their money wisely, and that becomes very difficult when one of your main activities actually with the trees, and that land is beautiful.
It is beautiful, and those walks are incredibly popular. So the last walk that was Wondrous Tree Fellowship actually has led some of those walks. So our group has helped to lead several of those walks. But the last walk, it was over 300 people came out to hear a speaker and to walk under those trees. So
oh wow,
I think that gives just an idea of the popularity and how much people really do want to know about the trees.
That's so interesting. Can you touch a little bit more how you said that trees communicate with each other? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, the trees, I don't know if you are familiar, if you've heard of Suzanne Simard. She's a scientist who was out at UBC, and I was actually out there at the same time as her, but we didn't cross paths because we were in different departments. But she's done a lot of work on how trees communicate. And there's underground networks on trees. So we have the root system, and then we also have something called mycorrhizae, which are fungal networks. And through those fungal networks, they associate with the roots, and they connect trees to each other. And they provide ways for nutrients and communication to happen between trees. And it also, so the tree gets those benefits, but the fungus also gets benefits. So in exchange for providing those services for the trees, it takes food. So the trees make sugar. And so the fungus takes sometimes up to a third of the sugars that the trees produce. And then the fungus uses that to continue to grow its networks. So trees are communicating underground all the time, and we know so little about it. And I think this is deep knowledge that First Nations had, but we didn't have it. Now we're just rediscovering that. So it's a whole other world below ground.
Mm-hmm. So if we want to find you, if we want to go to one of those activities, where can we find you guys?
Mm-hmm. We have a Facebook page, and we put most of our activities and events go on our Facebook page. We also collaborate with other groups. So we've recently done Tri-Cities Urban Forest Forum, and that's in collaboration with Burke Mountain Naturalists. And that was a very interesting event because it brings together elected representatives and city staff and experts and public all in one room, so to talk about trees. So we've done a couple of those. Those will be on our Facebook page, as well as Burke Mountain's Naturalist website and Facebook page. And mostly we don't have a website. We're not especially technical. We're more hands-on. So if you go to Wondrous Tree Fellowship's Facebook page, or contact us at wondrous.tree.fellowship@gmail.com.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
For everyone that's listening to us, you can find the Wondrous Tree Fellowship under their Facebook page. From La Société Francophone de Maillardville, the Tri-Cities Community Television, and myself, Genevieve, thank you for joining us.
Welcome you out to the 6th and last tree tour of 2023. I don't think it's rained all year, and I think we're going to keep it that way today, but it's so great to have you all here, whether it's your first or your 12th visit. Welcome. You'll see by the end of the day what a special place this is. And keep us in mind as we come to the end of the year for your donations. This is something local and fantastic that you can donate to. Lastly, I want to introduce our tree leader for this last 6th one, Egan Davis. There he is right there. Yes. You might know him in his many iterations of being just a wonderful Lower Mainland horticulturalist and arborist. He's now the current head of operations in Richmond. Before that, he was at White Rock, teaching in urban forestry at UBC. He also taught the UBC at the horticulture training program at UBC Botanical Garden, Banduzen. He speaks a lot around. You've probably seen him, you know him, you love him. It's great to have him here. It's just leading his first tree tour. I'm so surprised, but anyways, so great. And I'm going to hand it over to Nancy. She's going to do our land acknowledgement.
Thanks everyone for being here today. I was just going to yell at everyone, but wow, I've never seen so many people out here, so this is amazing. Before we get started on the tree walk, I just want to acknowledge that our tree walk today does take place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation. So we thank the Coquitlam people who continue to live on these lands and to care for the lands and the waters and all that lies above and below. And also just want to say that the Coquitlam people have lived here for thousands of years and have been good stewards of these lands, and I hope that going forward we can continue some good stewardship. Today I just want to also mention that we have the honor of being joined by Coquitlam Elder Marie Hooper and her daughter Tina and son Andrew. So thank you so much and enjoy the tree walk today.
I can't believe how many people are here. This is really, really exciting. How about a big hand for all of us who came out? It should be a lot of fun. I feel very honored to be leading this walk. It's actually kind of ironic because I really don't know the site very well. So if we get lost, I might have to ask for directions. No, that's not entirely true. But I love this place. This is an incredible collection of trees. There is nothing else like this anywhere in this region. This collection of trees, the maturity of the trees, and a little history on my experience with this place. In the early 90s, I came here when I was first learning plants and spent an entire day just looking at stuff, and I think I had a couple of references. And I left just feeling completely saturated. And you know that feeling when you go to, say, a museum or an art gallery or a place like this, and you just are like a sponge and there's so much to see. And I might have been here less than 10 times since. I've brought students here a few times. And every time, I just can't believe how big the trees are. I really can't. I mean, in this region, when we see a big tree on the street or in one of our parks, we might think, wow, that's a big tree, but it might only be 50 or 60 years old. But many of the trees here are older than that. And to see this many large trees in one place is really incredible. Interesting thing about what I really like about trees this time of year is the leaves are about to fall, correct? And at this time of year, I can hardly wait to see the trees without leaves because I really love the branching structure, the growth habit of the trees, the form, the shape. And then through the winter, I really enjoy looking at all of those things, which I think are rather sort of big picture items. And I also really like looking at the details like the buds. And there's terminal buds and lateral buds and bud scars. And where the leaves break off, they leave a little scar. And inside of that, all the tubes that supply water and nutrients to the leaves, those leave little scars. And I like looking at all those things through the winter. And then, March and April comes along, and April buds start to break. And I can't get enough at that time of year because every single day, the trees look entirely different in April. They open up a little bit more every day, and you start to see emergent foliage. And before the chlorophyll in the leaves starts to develop, it will be like peach colors and pink colors and maybe golden chartreuse colors. And then when the trees are completely foliated, I look at them and I think, I can't even imagine what that tree looks like without leaves. Of course I can, because I think about trees a lot. But, and then at this time of the year, I think, I can't imagine what those trees look like with leaves. And it's just this ongoing cycle. So anyhow, a couple of things that I wanted to point out today were, I really wanted to focus on the form, which is the shape of trees. And interestingly, when we see young trees, they're not much different than people in the sense that I know when I went from 5 feet to 6 feet, I did it really quickly. And I look kind of gangly, and I look at old pictures and I think, wow, I looked awkward then. And trees look awkward when they're really young. They often grow a lot, and then they start to fill out. What's really interesting here is a lot of these trees have reached a height which, I mean, they'll continue to grow taller, but not much. And so they tend to change their shape at a certain age, like 20, 30, 40 years. They might be somewhat pyramidal, maybe roundly pyramidal, but the top will be pointy. And at this stage, many of these trees, they're completely different. they're flat topped and the sides are straight. And so I always find that really interesting. Every time I come here, I think to myself, I thought I knew what shape, I know all these trees, and I thought I knew what they were like, but it's just an interesting study in how the form of a tree changes over time. Kind of like the form of your body changes over time. And then the other thing that I think I'd like to focus on today is the growth habit. So the growth habit is kind of everything within the form, you know, the angle of branch attachment, the posture of branches. Like a lot of branches are ascending, and sometimes they ascend and they arch and they kind of weep gracefully, and some of them have branches that alternate along the stem, and some of them have, I mean, it's all different. And so I'd like to focus on a little bit on those two things today as we walk around and look at some of the trees. And of course, every tree's got a different story, and so we'll look at some of those things as well. Anyhow, should we walk? Yeah. How do you get out of here? My wife asked me today, she's like, how many people will be there? And I was like, maybe 15, 20, maybe 30 or 40. Good to see. This is a really, really important place, really valuable trees, and it's really great to see everybody here appreciating that. So the first tree I wanted to feature here is this lovely big coniferous evergreen. And a deciduous tree will lose all of its leaves in the fall, but a conifer does exfoliate, and that's exfoliating now. So all the orange on it isn't really unusual, but what is unfortunate about western red cedar is you can see how thin that tree is at the top. And if western red cedar isn't an indication of some level of climate change happening, I don't know what is, because western red cedars in this region, especially since 2015 it didn't rain, I think from April till October. And before that, but really since then, there's been a lot of, like 2016, 17, a lot of western red cedars in the cities. There's a park near where I live, where I play with my dog, and all these western red cedars in 2017 turned orange, and the park looks shocking because all these orange trees, and now they're all dead, right? And so that's an indication that, you know, there's some speculation that in a few decades still, well, there certainly will be far fewer western red cedars growing naturally. And one of the things that is interesting to consider is that over time, you know, plants have migrated over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years across the earth. This is a species from Northern California which is adapted to hotter, drier summers. And I'm not suggesting we, you know, introduce these into our natural forest, but this is a Western North American conifer that is well adapted to the changing climate here. So that's just an interesting thing. Yeah, and another really, really beautiful thing about this tree is the bark, and you can't go in there to see the bark, and that's what's great about this particular tree, and many here, nobody's pruned this up. You know, when you're looking at trees in parks typically, or certainly on the street, all the trees are lifted up, so cars can get underneath, people can get underneath, lawnmowers can get underneath, and here to see a tree like this growing straight to the ground unpruned, that is gorgeous. There is a really good reference. If you, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the website is, but if you search Riverview Trees Inventory, there's a really nice reference that has maps and all the names of the trees and the date when they were planted as well. And a tree might have been planted at, you know, between 5 and 12 years old, so you can kind of add 5 to 10 years to anything there. So next to this is a giant redwood, which is another large Californian conifer, Sequoiadendron giganteum, and this tree has the potential, arguably, to be the most massive organism on the planet. So anybody been to see the redwoods in the interior of California? Not the coastal redwoods, but the, yeah, and you see like General Sherman and these 3,000 plus year old trees. That's giant redwood. And would you believe it? Frequently you see these planted underneath power lines and right against the side of a house. This is not a very good residential tree. I've seen this tree planted out 50 feet away from a house, causing the foundation to crack. So this is not a tree for for a residential situation. But in a park, I mean, and this is a baby, right? And it can easily get 2,000, 3,000, well, 1,000 plus years old is still, really, it could get a lot older, right? Interesting thing about redwoods, and then we'll move on because there's some, oh man, there are some great trees here. I'm getting really excited. I'm shaking. But the giant redwood, interesting thing about redwoods is, you know, tens of thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, redwoods as a conifer were a ubiquitous species along bands of latitude on the planet. And then with climate change, like glaciation and continental drift, literally, and mountains being, you know, thrusting up out of the earth and dividing land masses, creating different climates on, say, the water side of a mountain range and on the range shadow side of a mountain range. So all of these various things have changed the climate where redwoods at one point were quite ubiquitous. And now you only see redwoods in fragmented populations around the world, which is quite interesting. In California, you have the coastal redwoods, and inland you have the giant redwoods. And also in like Louisiana and Texas, you have swamp cypress, which are a relative of a redwood, and they're deciduous. And a neat thing about swamp cypress is that many, like 150,000 years ago, they grew at the North Pole. Don't cite, it wasn't exactly 150,000 years ago, but many, many thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago, they grew at the North Pole when the North Pole had a temperate climate. And then glaciation has pushed those populations south. And then as glaciers receded with warming climate, those populations didn't rebound because they don't move very fast. And now they're still down in Louisiana and Texas where the ice sheets left them, and they're still deciduous. They are deciduous, not this one, but the redwoods in, the redwood relatives in Louisiana and Texas, they're deciduous because on the North Pole there's 24 hours of darkness almost in the wintertime. And now they grow in a very, very warm climate, and yet they're still deciduous. So they've maintained that adaptation even though they're in a much warmer climate. And they can be planted in much colder climates. Interesting thing. So I guess the story here, though, is redwoods at one point were very, very common across the earth, and now they just grow in these. There's a couple of species in China. There's dawn redwood, which we'll see later on today, a small population that Western botanists previously thought was extinct. And then there's Glyptostrobus in China, which grows in the ditches along the sides of rice paddies, but just fragmented pockets, kind of neat. And we've got this. So anyhow, let's head toward, there's a big group. So I think what we'll do is we'll take some time and make sure everybody's, we're going to the brick building there. This is a sycamore maple, and they're planted in a group like this. And I also like trees, you know, of the same species planted in groups. A new style of planting, Miyawaki mini forests. Has anybody heard of the Miyawaki style of planting? Got a few hands? So Miyawaki style, this is a grove of one species, but a Miyawaki forest, you take a number of species, and we're using native trees in some of our larger parks, take a number of tree species and a number of native shrub species, and you plant them really densely together, really, really densely, and then the idea is that you force competition. And by forcing competition, the strong ones will obviously survive and outcompete trees that are less well suited for the areas that they're in. And you get fast establishment, and these mini forests will outcompete weeds, hopefully like blackberry, for example, right? So we're planting in Richmond these Miyawaki, Dr. Miyawaki, the Japanese forester, and came up with this method, and we've used it prescriptively, and we're also doing similar plantings in the city of Richmond, doing mini forests that are Miyawaki-esque in style. So just different ways of growing plants in a community like this, or growing them open grown. Just now we were talking about the concept of plant competition and plant communities, and one of the biggest principles to understand about the way plants grow together is that plant ecology, one of the primary elements of plant ecology is competition. There's a few things here. So take a look at these beech trees, and look, they are completely outcompeting the ability for anything to grow. There's nothing growing underneath here because they shade out all the light. they drop this amazing amount of leaf on the ground, and therefore they don't have to worry about competition from other species because they dominate. And I've been to beech forests before, and not only Western European beech, but Oriental beech, which is in like Turkey and sort of the Eastern Europe, Western Asia. And this is a beech forest. Beech trees and beech leaves, and nothing grows underneath them. The odd yew tree and a few ferns here and there, but for the most part, this is a beech forest. And another really great thing that this particular area illustrates really well is not everybody's underneath the trees, and that's probably good because there's a lot of people, and I don't think we have to worry about compaction, but this number of people maybe. But I'm kicking away the top layer of leaves. They look like leaves. They're beautiful, aren't they, too? They're coppery in color, and they're sort of consistent in the texture. But underneath the top layer, I pull the second layer up, and these are last year's leaves. And they're shredding. You can see that millipedes and worms and beetles are shredding through this, and I can recognize this material as being leaves still, but it's dark in color. It's starting to decompose as well. And if I kick away a little more and I get into 2 years ago, this has been on the ground now. This is its third year on the ground, and it's shredded even more so. It's broken down even more. And then underneath that is basically compost. So this is humus, and it's just incredibly rich, nutritious, organic material. And as worms tunnel into the soil and back up into these leaves, they will actually mix this material into the topsoil, and you get these incredible layers here. Like when you think about what we do in gardens, you might have a garden at home and or a park, and there will be topsoil. And how deep will the topsoil be? 6 inches, 3 inches, maybe a foot. And then what's underneath that? Some kind of graded out material that's compacted, maybe construction materials or some kind of graded out subsoil. And then maybe on top we might buy some mulch in a bag or a truckload and put mulch on top. But we have very, very distinctive layers, profile layers in horticulture, right? But what I just described in here, there's a very rich transition from coarse leaves into the subsoil. And all of that just happens with time, and it's not being disturbed, it's left alone. And it's incredible really because these trees have surface roots, and they have deep roots that anchor the tree. The surface roots are the roots that pull up a lot of water and nutrition. And when you think about the annual cycle and weather that we have in our climate here, in the spring, like May, June, there's a lot of moisture in the surface, and trees, the surface roots are pulling up all the nutrient that's cycling. All the nutrients in the soil are being brought up into the trees, and the trees are producing leaves. They're photosynthesizing, they're taking carbon from the air and hydrogen from water and nutrients and producing all this biomass. And then all of that falls to the ground, and then it breaks down. None of it's available to the plants in that form, but it breaks down with large insects and worms, and then bacteria, and they convert it from an organic form to an inorganic form. The trees can take it back up again. And it's really interesting too, when trees are growing, the surface is moist, and that's when that's all happening. And then July and August gets dry, the surface dries down, the trees stop growing, and then they produce buds for next year. And they harden off because it's hot and dry. Imagine soft, juicy growth in August. Right? It would just, you go limp like lettuce on your counter in the summertime, right? And then the trees defoliate. And so what I really enjoy thinking about is this cycle of the nutrient cycling, the leaves dropping, the time of year, the weather that we have, and the activity in the soil, like the feeding roots in the spring and the anchoring roots in the summer. It's really, all of it kind of synchronizes, doesn't it? And another interesting layer to that is when the sun in the spring and the early summer, the angle that the sun comes through the lens of the Earth's atmosphere, what gets filtered and comes through is more blue and green light, which stimulates growth. And then when the sun's higher, it's red light that comes through, and that stimulates reproduction like flowers. And so plants grow in the spring and they produce flower buds in the summer. And those buds either open right away or they wait till the spring and open. But all of these things are synchronized. The weather, the nutrient cycles, isn't that really interesting? You know, there's a lot of pieces there and they all kind of work together. Let's keep going. So I'm stopping us here, as this isn't a really big tree. I can almost, hold on. Oh, I can't quite get my fingers around it. But this is a Turkish oak, Quercus cerris. And I love oaks. A colleague of mine, when I worked at the Botanical Garden, Douglas Justice, who a lot of you have probably been on tours of this site with Douglas. And I don't work with him anymore, but I did, and I loved it because I remember going into his office one day and his eyes were glued to his computer screen. He had a bunch of books out and some samples on his desk. And I just said, oh, what are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm looking at oaks. I love oaks. And I'm like, I do too. And we just kind of nerded out on oaks. Oaks, wow, if you wanted to specialize in learning about a particular group of plants, you could spend your life studying oaks and feel like you'd never really grasped everything. Interesting thing about oaks is that they're quite promiscuous when they create seeds. So if you have a Turkish oak and an English oak and a red oak and they produce seeds and you harvest those seeds, what you get, you don't know. They'll be hybrids. They hybridize freely. And another thing I like about oaks, I just love the bark. Isn't that great? I love bark patterns, I really, really do. You can see that it's fissured vertically and horizontally, and it kind of breaks off into these flat, platey, almost block-like pieces. And there's a really lovely texture, and there's some patterns, but it's also kind of irregular too. Anyhow, let's keep going. Certainly never let it. Look where you're going.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. This is a silver linden, Tilia tomentosa. And you see the one on the right? Does that not look like a bread box on its side? For those of you who use bread boxes, look how flat it is on the top and how I had an epiphany. And this is not going to sound true. You're not going to believe this, but I have a friend named Lyndon, and I brought him here. He's from Alberta, and this place blew his mind. And I took Lyndon to this Lyndon, and I stood him underneath it and walked off, and I kind of counted how many lindens fit underneath that linden. And I was trying to determine how tall it is. Anybody want to guess on how tall that tree is?
45 lindens.
45 lindens? 30 meters? No. 35, 40 meters? Do I hear 40 meters? It's a big tree. That's a very tall tree. And you know, there's some big things around too, like big buildings, which if this was next to a residential house, it would look even bigger, right? There's a few ways, you know, arborists will have electronic tools to measure tree height. I park down that way. So just where the street turns, that might be far enough away. If you stand at a distance and you hold your thumb out and close one eye and you get it so the top of the tree's at the top of your thumb and the bottom's at the bottom, and then you bend it sideways and you get somebody or something to, you know, you place something or get somebody to stand where your thumb's on the ground, and then you pace out that distance, that's how tall that tree is, roughly. It's actually a pretty good, you know, it works pretty well. So I'd like to do that actually, but today when I was scouting around, I was looking at it from over there and I held my thumb up, and my thumb, I needed to be way back to make that work. Remember when we started, I said how interesting it is here to see trees and the shape of the trees here versus the shape of trees in our normal environment. There's not too many of these silver lindens around the city. They're not really unusual, but anybody ever park your car on the street and you go away for half an hour and you come back and there's little specks of honeydew on your windshield, or if you park for a day or two, it gets really sticky, and if you leave it for a long time, a fungus called sooty mold grows on that honeydew. Well, the honeydew is aphid excrement, but it sounds gross, but it literally spends no time in the aphid. There's so much pressure in the cell, and actually when you think about it, okay, so that, let's say that tree's 100 feet tall. I think it's taller. And sorry, I was born in the 70s, and so I'm metric in some ways, imperial in others. I get PSI. So for every foot in elevation, water, it's 0.433, so half a PSI basically to pump water 1 foot in elevation. So to pump water to the top of that tree, if it was 100 feet tall and it's taller, it would be 50 PSI. Your garden hose is usually 30 PSI. So you can imagine how much pressure that's pumping. And so an aphid is a tiny little insect with a piercing and sucking mouthpart, and it sticks its mouthpart, which is like a needle, into a cell, and it just blasts right in and shoots right out its butt. And so it does, and it's just like it's like tapping into a fire hose. And so you think this is gross, and I've done this with groups at this time of year, not so much, but like in June. And I've taken people on a tree walk, and I did this. I was like, hey, everybody, put your tongue out. I'm like, can you taste it? It's kind of sweet. And they're like, yeah, it's sweet, it's sweet. I'm like, do you know what that is? And they're like, no. And then you tell them it's bug poop. But it's really not that bad. Anyways, so linden trees in Vancouver and other cities have a bad reputation for honeydew. But these ones are way less of an issue. In fact, almost not problematic at all, because tomentose, the fuzz, the tomentosum on the leaves, it protects them from insects. And so they're a fuzzy-leafed linden, and they're really, really great. And anyways, the ones in the city are kind of like an egg that's bigger on the, if you had an egg like that, you think, wow, it's a weird egg, but they're kind of like an egg that's wider on the bottom. And look at this, that's not egg shaped. That's like a rectangle. And that was the epiphany that I had, because if you study trees, you learn about their form. And what I learned at that point was we're only really referring to the form that they have for that year 20 to year 50 kind of period. Then after that, their form changes. I thought that was neat. Maybe you do too, or you're just like, that's weird. I'm not interested at all. Isn't that great? Anyways, let's keep going this way, up the little path. This is how I lead groups. I'm like, my favorite tree is right around the corner. That's a big tree, isn't it? You know, if you saw a western red cedar that tends to grow quickly that fat, you think, wow, that's a big tree, but see an oak that big, they don't grow as fast, they don't put on as much girth as quickly, so that's a big old oak tree. Wow, what a great tree. Very good. Yeah, there's some neat trees in here. There's a cryptomeria, a Japanese cedar here, which actually isn't a cedar. You know the word cedar. We know western red cedar. This is a Japanese cedar. In Japan, they call the Japanese word for this is sugi. And then we call hemlocks, the genus for hemlock is suga, but it's not a cedar. And if you go down to the tropics, what they call a cedar down there is a deciduous tropical tree. That word is used so differently everywhere you go. Anyways, I just wanted to keep on going. And, the leaves are very different. You know, if you're trying to identify a tree by the leaves are the most variable part of the tree. So you can get 10 leaves from the same oak tree, and you can see so much variety, such to the point where you think that those 10 leaves came off 10 different trees. And this is a scarlet oak, and they have pointed lobes, and then the sinus in between the lobes is kind of rounded. Some oaks, like white oaks, will have rounded lobes, and they're quite different. So you can kind of tell some big parts of the groups, but the leaf looks just like a pin oak. But if you look at the growth habit of this tree, everything about this, the branches are ascending. And I struggled with identifying the difference between pin oaks and scarlet oak, Quercus coccinea, and it can be really difficult. Like oaks can be really tricky to tell apart sometimes. But one key thing, and it can be, no two plants are the same too, right? So you look at one Quercus coccinea and you look at another one, and they'll be different. But the one key thing is that the branches ascend as opposed to that pin oak piece. So that's kind of a neat thing. And it's a really interesting study because in the wintertime, what's really fun to do is to just appreciate the growth habit, the branch line of trees that you're seeing, the angle of branch attachment, all those pieces, or just look at them and just think, wow, that's really beautiful. I've actually never done this, but I've always wanted to do a drawing study of oaks, or not just oaks, of trees generally in the wintertime. And that's a really fun thing to do. Maybe your goal might not be to be able to identify trees, because really, I think it's just important that you think they're beautiful. Knowing which one's which is maybe, trivial in some ways. But what can happen is you start seeing them differently. And what I always really enjoyed about teaching plant ID with students is that you point out all these various features that somebody maybe never appreciated in the past. And then from that point forward, you will never look at plants or trees the same way again. And so that's kind of a fun thing about growth habit. And then what can happen is you can look at something and just know that it's a pin oak. And somebody might say, well, how do you know that's a pin oak? And you're like, I don't know, it just is. Because you just have that familiarity, right? It's like seeing a silhouette of your friend and you know by their gait who it is by the way they walk. So just standing around here, standing at this point here, you can see there's a big Himalayan cedar. Again, the word cedar. Yeah, not a western red cedar, that's cedrus, that's in the pine family. And our western red cedar is in the cypress family. So there you go, the word cedar again. But isn't that a beautiful tree? And then when it gets cold and when you start getting the short days, the chlorophyll molecule starts to break down. And then you have other pigments. Don't you love the word xanthocyanin? Like xantho is yellow, xanthocyanins and carotenoids, and there's anthocyanins, so there's yellow, orange, and red pigments in a green leaf, but they're masked by chlorophyll. And the chlorophyll breaks down, and then you get all those other pigments that are then visible. If you get sun, you'll get good colors. If you get cold, you'll get really good colors. And we haven't had the cold this year. It's been pretty warm. And what happens here versus back east where everybody says we have such great fall color on the East Coast, and it's true. And the reason why is you get the cold, and then the chlorophyll molecule breaks down really quickly. What happens here is as the chlorophyll molecule starts to break down, the leaf also starts decomposing, and it sort of turns brown. And anyhow, so every year is different. But this year, red oaks aren't red. They're like pumpkin orange, and I don't mind that. This is a fall day you'll never forget. Standing underneath these Norway maples and all these leaves, and you can smell, that smell of fall? You know how it smells sweet? Do you know what that is? That literally is sugar, right? That's the sugar breaking down. You know when you cook sugar and it smells like caramel? That's when sugars break down, they release a gas called maltol. And in the fall, the sugars in the leaves break down and you get the same maltol gas. And so that's why in the fall you get these sweet smells of fall leaves breaking down. It's sugars breaking down. That's the smell of sugars breaking down. So that is dawn redwood. So here's a mouthful for you. Metasequoia glyptostroboides. I have a friend who's interested in plants, and they taught their child to say that when he was like 3. Metasequoia glyptostroboides. So that is in it's in the group of redwoods. That tree, Western botanists only knew that tree as a fossil before 1945. And then there was a report of this growing in a small village in China, and a number of Western botanists and Chinese botanists collected the seed and introduced it into the nursery trade as a living fossil, and generated quite a bit of excitement. And because of that, a lot of these trees were planted in the 60s and the 70s. And around Vancouver, you'll see a lot of metasequoias that are little smaller than that, but they're not uncommon. So I don't know. There's maybe a couple thousand, literally, in growing in nature, and there's many more growing in many different places, parks, gardens around the world. So they're a very, very common tree now, but they're only known to grow in a few really, really small fragmented populations in China, and that's it. And yet, were once a very broadly distributed group of plants. And so Metasequoia, the genus, there's fossils for Metasequoia in Western North America. So before a much more widely distributed group of plants, redwoods. So that's sort of back where we started, right?
So Egan Davis, thank you so much for leading our tree tour today. Can you tell us a little bit about how you feel about the trees on site here?
Oh, wow. The trees here on this site are remarkable. There is nowhere else, anywhere remotely close to here, that has a collection of trees that is this diverse, that the trees are this old. Everything about this site is just, it's such an incredible place.
Thank you so much for being the leader today. I think
Thank you.
The crowds loved you.
I had a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thanks for inviting
again,
me.
and we hope to have you back out again.
Oh, it would be a pleasure. Thank you.